This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The MiddleGround Mic is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now or support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the MiddleGround Mic. Before we dive in, if you're listening on podcast, YouTube, whatever, hit follow, drop a review. It really helps more people find a balanced show like this. Today I'm joined by Lisa Ekman. Is that how you say your last name? I should have asked
Indeed.
before.
It is, yes.
She spent 20 years as Democratic lobbyist, before going through a major shift during COVID. And it seems like a lot of people, went through that shift. Some, I feel like, kind of like what they said in the 60s, the big switch. I feel like that kind of happened again. The big switch. She's got a great book out there, Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elite. She takes a hard look at the movement, that was once about inclusivity and turned into something much more. A good person for that as well that I've come to really like over the last 5-6 years is Bill Maher. That reminds me of Bill Maher. Still very leans that way, but he's kind of come back to common sense. Before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I was a Democratic advocate and lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for about 20 years. I was raised by two pretty liberal parents. I often joke that they were hippies who did not do drugs, so they had the 60s, you do you, I'll do me, we can agree to disagree, we want a big tent, and all about everybody's rights, everybody's freedoms. And I think I was raised with a healthy skepticism of the government and, look out for the man, don't really trust the intelligence agencies, that kind of a thing, which seemed to get eroded over time. And we can talk about that, on the left. I went to college, I got a master's in social work and I got a law degree and I went to DC and I thought, you know what, I'm going to try to make our country a better place for people with disabilities. And so I was doing disability policy advocacy for the most part. I did a lot of work on healthcare. I worked for a couple of different senators, including Ted Kennedy and Jim Jeffords, who was a Republican who left the Republican Party in 2001. I also worked at federal agencies, worked for government contractors, nonprofits, sort of got to see the entire infrastructure and ecosystem of DC from different sides. And I was a hardcore, dedicated liberal warrior. I was vote blue no matter who. I was, to the point that I made some of the assumptions that a lot of people on the left do about people on the right, that if you're voting Republican, you must be at least a little bit racist because their policies are racist, which I no longer believe. I believe that there is a difference in opinion of how to best support individuals of every race or group, and that disagreement is about policy and not about morality and not about the value of the people that you're talking about. Spent 20 years doing that. And I think I cried on election night in 2016 when Donald Trump was, or 2015, 2016, when he got elected. And I, thought the world was going to end. And it obviously didn't. But I definitely believed everything the media told me about Donald Trump. He was racist, how misogynistic he was, what an awful individual he was. And, a lot of the things they said about what he was going to do to our country and destroy our democracy. And I did air quotes there because, we are not a democracy. We are a democratic republic. But I believed in that. I believed that he was going to roll back rights for people and that it was going to be a disaster. So I, continued my hardcore Democratic advocacy up until 2020. And I, will say that during the 20 years that I was in DC, I moved there in 1999 at the tail end of the Clinton administration. Things had changed a lot in DC, and I felt like I was becoming less and less able to have an impact unless you had a lot of money. We can talk about that if you'd like. I think lobbying and the impact that money has had in DC has is one of the reasons why people feel, rightly so, that their government is no longer responsive to the concerns of the voters. And I was starting to get a little bit, disappointed and feeling like I wasn't really having an impact. So I decided I was going to retire on March 1st of 2020. And if you can bring your mind back to then, that was right at the heart of the 2 weeks to flatten the curve, the beginning of the lockdown. And so, sort of my higher power, my angel, said, "You don't want to be doing this anymore." And I retired right around that time. And then I started to ask some questions about what was going on. My partner, who was my boyfriend at the time, he was not, going along with the COVID measures. He, said they didn't make a lot of sense. He didn't see the science, and he and I were fighting about that. And he, like many people who are independent thinkers or in the middle or on the right, were basically saying, do your own research, prove me wrong. And he said one thing to me. I mentioned this to you before, Joe, but he said, if they'll poison our water, what won't they do? And my brain skidded to a halt and said, you know what? You're right. They do poison our water. The fluoride's in the water. We're 70% water. We can't be healthy with bad water. And so it got me to start thinking again and start asking questions and really digging into, is what the media is telling me true? Is what they've said about Donald Trump true? Why is it that every media station, every news platform of the mainstream legacy media says the exact same thing? Why are they using the exact same words? Why do they switch from one story to another in lockstep? Why isn't anyone asking hard questions anymore, in the media? And I say anymore, but I should, the caveat, if they ever did, because I'd have to go really back and look at that to see if they actually were trying to hold power to account. And I woke up and I reclaimed my brain and gave myself permission to think again, ask questions again, and really decided that um, I was still a classical liberal in my heart in many ways, meaning freedom is the most important thing. Individual liberty has to be where we start. And, that's very much at odds with any sort of communalism philosophy, whether that be communism, socialism. And it doesn't mean that we don't care about our neighbors, and it doesn't mean that we don't care about our community. What it means is that if we don't have individual freedoms, then whoever's in power decides is going to matters, and our individual choices and freedom and liberty don't. And I guess if I had to distill it down, that's the basic of it: is freedom of speech is the right from which all of our other rights spring
Correct.
and depend. And the people who censor and the people who do not protect freedom of speech are never on the right side of history. So, and I decided I want to be on the right side of history, and that I love this country. Not that it is a fault-free country, but I love this republic and the First Amendment, with all of the rights. And I like to remind people of this, Joe, because people just think freedom of speech, and maybe they think freedom of religion or press, but it's also where our freedom of association and our freedom of
Yes.
assembly come from. And all of those natural born rights that are enshrined in the First Amendment were being trampled on during COVID, which I will remind people that there is no public health exception to our Constitution. So you don't just get to suspend these fundamental freedoms because of a public health emergency, which they did without so much as a conversation about whether or not that was appropriate. And no other country has ever had a First Amendment like ours. And I wanted to write my book, Deprogramming Democrats, because I wanted to do what I felt I could to help protect our republic. And I really do think that what has happened on the left is very cult-like, and we can talk more about that, if that's how the conversation goes. But that's sort of my background, why I wrote the book, how I sort of woke up. And I should say I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having the
Oh
conversation with
no,
me.
I appreciate it.
And
How did you end up finding this podcast?
online. I mean, just
Okay.
searching.
Yeah, no, it's it's crazy. When I first started this, I did get some people that were a little bit conservative to come on. But what really kind of, if you want to say like launched it and really got the downloads to go is when I had a gentleman. His name's Dan Schaefer, and we've become really good friends. He's a state house candidate in Missouri, and he's in a heavily red district, and he got almost 40% of the vote, which is crazy in a state down there, where if it's a heavily red district. Like I believe he said it went like crazy, like some 70, 80% for Trump. And it just kind of, we talked and then it was like all of a sudden, all right, the downloads just kind of started going crazy. And then it just kind of started growing and it started growing and it started growing. And then it just kind of went kaboom. And it just made me think it's like, okay, there really is a market out there because I wasn't sure if people really wanted to hear something besides what somebody would tell them to make them feel better about their side, whether it's right or left. Because both sides, I would say more the left than right, but both sides really have like the far extremes. If they don't have an echo chamber, they're tuned out. And I was like, okay, we got to get away from that because no matter what, we all occupy the same zones, same cities. We got to work on getting back to, even though if you're my neighbor and you're like quote unquote political enemy, let's have a coffee together. Let's stand at the fence line and talk about our dogs and our kids and understand that. And that's just kind of like where, things went with this. And, especially once I seen your site and we reached out and the Deprogramming Democrats, and I'm like, man, that is, it's something that we need everybody to want to do. If you're extreme, no matter who you are, you got to remember that there's an opposite person. They got to remember, like when people are saying, oh, hey, Trump wants to kill free speech. And it's like, well, you weren't saying that when Mark Zuckerberg came out and revealed the Biden administration was trying to silence conservatives and pressured regulatory retaliation if they didn't do it. That was more of an action than the FTC or not FTC,
FC.
SC, yeah, to come out and say essentially if they don't cancel Jimmy Kimmel, they're going to come after him. That's just saying it. The Biden administration did it covertly, and they went to they went to Facebook, to Google. Google just came out and said they're lifting the ban on a lot of people, and it's wild.
Let's take a quick break.
The MiddleGround Mic isn't just another podcast. It's a movement for unity, for truth, for a future beyond the left and the right. But movements don't grow without people willing to stand up. Subscribe now on Buzzsprout. Fuel this mission directly on PayPal. Every subscription keeps the fire burning. The links are in the show notes. Be more than a listener. Be part of the middle ground.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, became really clear to me is that a lot of you are in an echo chamber. You're in a social media and media ecosystem. So many people don't ever want to even listen to someone who they don't agree with. And part of this starts in school. And, when we're talking, I mentioned this to you, Joe, but so the listening audience knows, I'm going to talk about a lot of things from the Democratic perspective because that's where I come from. But I want it to be clear to everybody that I believe that members of the establishment, whether they be left or right, suffer from some of these same things. I can only really speak to the left because that's where I spent my times. When I say this, and I think the other thing that really maybe amplifies it on the left is that you tend to see a lot more higher education among people on the left. And what I talk about in the book, indoctrination through schools, is one of the ways in which people become in this groupthink. And so they will only listen to someone who has a degree and credentials from the government. So you'll see this all the time on social media, two people trying to have a discussion or an argument or whatever. And the person on the left will say, well, who's your source? And then if that source is someone that doesn't have the official stamp of approval, they'll dismiss you outright without even looking at what that person has to say. the data or the evidence that they use to support their argument, or what the argument actually even is. And I call this the creation of a monopoly on knowledge that the left has instituted. And the way that it gets really reinforced is the fact that if you are on the left and you have that degree and you have that credential, now you're an expert. So you have to support that system because it's where you get your credibility from in the ecosystem in which you're, living in and working in. So, once you're sort of trapped in that ecosystem, it's really hard to penetrate and get new ideas through. And, even you can throw on top of that all of the fact checking organizations because they are all left leaning. So, I will sadly and somewhat embarrassingly admit that back in the day, I used to say, oh, well, Snopes debunked that. Well, yeah, maybe Snopes did, but you know what Snopes does is the same thing you can do and go do some research on the internet, and they're not particularly experts. And where do they get their funding from? And this is something that I would encourage, one of the things that helped me to kind of break through the programming is follow the money and question everything. So who paid for it? We hear a lot about paid protests. Well, who paid for that protest? So why are they out there? Do they really care about this, or is it because they're getting paid to be there? Who paid for it? Who benefits from it? And where does the money go after it leaves wherever you're looking at? And so this can kind of help you kind of go, oh, well, yeah, I didn't realize that this was all just paid protesters, or I didn't realize that the government through USAID was paying for that in this other country. And maybe that's why people are talking that way. And who did the USAID money go to, and where does it get back to? But at the basic level, it's starting to just ask questions again, questioning the expertise and questioning those things that are sort of sacrosanct among people of your own party. And if you can't ask those questions, then you're going to be stuck in the groupthink that people have. You're only going to get confirmation bias. So you're going to look at things that are confirming what you already believe. And you are really not thinking for yourself or thinking critically. And that's kind of how, if you start thinking about those things, you can kind of break through. And I think when you're talking about these things and you're talking about censorship, I think people have a very short memory, and people have an ability to sort of block out the fact that maybe they aren't being consistent with a position that they had in the past. And oftentimes that is because if they admit in this one instance that their party has lied to them or their party has led them astray, and they have invested so much of their identity into that party, admitting that one thing will cause the entire illusion to collapse. I kind of liken it to the thread on the sweater. You pull that thread and you're not expecting the entire the sweater to unravel, but it does. And that was the question that my partner asked me about: if they'll poison our water, what won't they do? The entire house of cards came crashing down. And, sometimes it's very challenging because it's really hard in today's day and age sometimes to know what's real and what's true.
Right.
And there's a lot of security in saying, well, if my party says it, it's always true. There's a lot of, but that is also the way that you can get manipulated and misled very easily on any side of the question. If you're not asking questions and being critical, especially of those who you're supposed to trust.
Yeah. Speaking of that trust part, so we're when you talk about the Democratic Party, Democratic movement, however you'd like to phrase it, and, you did a lot of lobbyist stuff, and you worked for senators. Maybe give the people a little bit of, and obviously kind of related to your book, right? What behind the scenes do people really not know? You know what I mean? What are those nuances that make a difference that maybe people don't realize?
So I think this changed a lot over my time in Washington, Joe, because I feel like when I first got to Washington around the turn of the century, 99, 2000, 2001, there were a lot of really good faith conversations between people with differing views to try to come to some sort of compromise around policy. And I think that that really changed over the past 25 years. I think that so as we sit here a few days away from a government shutdown, I think this is a really good example to give to you. Back when I first started, we would go through what was regular order on budget bills. So that there would be a budget that was published. And then within that budget, each of the appropriations committees would come up with, they would get a number, and then they would create a bill and they would hold hearings. And this would be a bill that, could be negotiated on, and then they'd pass the bill. And then you would pass an appropriation bill. And that stopped happening completely. And now basically it all gets worked out behind the scenes without talking to people, and a few people who happen to be in the room get to have input. And who are those people? Well, oftentimes it's a lot of lobbyists, because they get the ear of the people who work on the appropriations committee. And, I want to be really careful, because I'm not trying to imply that any of these lobbyists are doing anything illegal or inappropriate, but it's the nature of the system now that, if you are a member of the House, you're, a representative in the House, you're fundraising like 3 days after you're sworn in for your next election. Yes, you are, because you have to raise money for yourself. You have to raise money for the party. You often have a PAC that you raise money for that helps other people in the party. And so it's only 2 years, so you're constantly raising money. So what does raising money actually look like? We have a lot of lunches or dinners that lobbyists pay $1,000 a plate or more to come and sit and have a meal with you. Now, there's no quid pro quo. That doesn't mean you're going to get your bill passed, or you're going to get your number you want in appropriations. But what it does mean is that you now have an open line of communication with that office, and you have access that someone who didn't give $1,000 doesn't have. And if you are a lobbyist who's trying to get your, ornament on the Christmas tree, as they call it, so the omnibus bill now that they pass instead of passing separate appropriations bills has everything in it, and you want your ornament, you think it's easier to hide an ornament in one bill, or that you'd have to get it into a smaller bill where everyone's paying really attention to what goes into that bill. Well, it's a lot easier to sort of hide that ornament in the bill. That is this omnibus bill that people get, that's thousands of pages long, that the representatives get 2 or 3 days, maybe to look at. We've heard this, a number of times. Well, you're going to have to pass the bill to know what's in it, right? No one's reading the 1,000-page spending bill. They're relying on their staff to tell them what's in it, but it's a lot harder to fight against that as a voter than it would be if you were passing separate bills and the nursing home industry is, I need them to get more money. They're helping my mom, or whatever you're trying to advocate for. It's hard to even know what's going to be in the bill to advocate for or against it. And this goes on every day. There are these fundraisers, and it's like they do retreats where you can pay $5,000 and go spend a weekend with a bunch of congressmen and congresswomen. And the amount of money spent on lobbying, was a breathtaking figure to me: $4.5 billion last year on lobbying at the federal level.
That's still just crazy to me. That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And if you just think about it, I think anybody who is a voter who has voted for more than maybe 1 or 2 elections I think gets the sense that their vote doesn't matter the way that it used to. The accountability of their federal representatives is not the same as it used to be. And I think that they're not wrong about that. I think that this inundation of money into these elections is crazy, because over almost $17 billion, I think, was spent on the federal elections in 2024. And,
Yeah.
how do voters compete with that?
Yeah, no, especially like just like the presidential part. That really made me think about Gary Johnson in 2016. Really, really liked his platform. And, like I had told you earlier, I kind of honestly grew up as a libertarian, right? My dad was heavy pro union, heavy Democrat. So I'm sure you can imagine being in that camp and then having a libertarian son was like oil and water. Some of our conversations were, pretty explosive. I mean, never got like crazy, but it was, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm older than you, and we got crazy, and but what I didn't like is, Gary Johnson actually put that party on the map. They've always been around, but he really got them like, he was obviously, in their terms, he was a lot more of a libertarian, if you want to call it that, than they had ever been used to or seen. And a lot of people voted for him, even libertarians. But then the party turned on him. And then the system also changed. I forget what the commission's called, their company, whatever that does the debate. They raised the percentage you had to because he was like going up the chart so fast. They essentially stifled him out. And at that point, I was sitting there and I'm like, man, this guy, and they went after the Aleppo thing, where he didn't know it. I'm like, you know what? 99.9% of politicians probably don't know what Aleppo is, and that's not like a dig on them. It's just, unless you're doing certain things, you're probably not going to know a whole lot about it. That's just part of life. You can't know everything about everything. That's why you have people that work for you. And it really threw me back because I was like, okay, you know, Hillary Clinton didn't do anything to be like, hey, everybody should have a seat at the table. And to be fair, neither did President Trump. In the end, it was made sure that it was okay, boom. I mean, he didn't have a chance in God's green earth to ever get elected, but he had a chance to really change the tone because I think, in terms of budgets, if you could get libertarians on some budget committees, I think you might actually see the value of our money rise because they would be like, hey, we got to get out of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, um, I think what we saw in 2024 I think we've seen behind the curtain a little bit. I'll go back to 2016, even with what happened to Bernie Sanders in the, primary, and then what happened with the replacement of President Biden with Kamala Harris, without so much as one vote being cast for her. But we're defending democracy, right? But sorry, I get a little
No,
snarky
yeah,
sometimes.
no, I seen a Joe Rogan episode with Bernie Sanders on there recently, and that
Yeah,
opened my eyes even more.
and I think this gets back to what I was saying when I wanted to be clear that, like, I am not pro-Republican and anti-Democrat. I'm sort of pro-Constitution and anti-corrupt establishment. And I think we've really seen how corrupted the process actually is. That, you when you and I were talking earlier, Joe, you mentioned the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. hearing where he was calling out Senator Sanders and Senator Warren over how much money they've taken from Big Pharma. And I think, there's a real growing understanding by the people of how the process has been co-opted by moneyed interests. Oligarchs may be part of it. I, for one, for example, might want to see some guardrails put on artificial intelligence, but how much money are tech companies spending to not have any guardrails put on, how artificial
Probably spend a lot.
intelligence gets a lot of money. And so it becomes, I think, it becomes challenging to figure out how we get rid of that corruption and get the power back to we, the people, the voters. And, I think you and I would agree that part of doing that is taking some of the power away from the federal government and bringing it back to states and local communities, as was envisioned by the Constitution, And so, by the way, in case anyone wanted to look into lobbying, there's a great website called opensecrets.org. And you can find out any politician all their lobbying disclosures, who gave them money, how much they have taken. And that's where I'm getting
typing that in right now.
Yeah, that's where I'm getting the statistics that I was using, was opensecrets.org. And I think the other thing that, I think sort of goes along with this and is like thinking about how much money some of these elected representatives and senators have made through stock purchases while they have been in office and may have been privy to information that any of us would get prosecuted for as insider information based on their position. And, I think Nancy Pelosi is the biggest example that you can probably turn to. She would say, well, it was all my husband. I didn't do it. But,
How do you think he found out?
he's definitely beating the averages by a lot. And,
The
I
CHIP
think
Act.
it also comes back to, I would be in favor after being in DC for a long time of term limits. I don't, think our founding fathers did not envision lifelong politicians, you know. I can 100% attest that living in Washington, D.C. is like living in a bubble. It is living, you are not in touch with what an average American in your state or in your district goes through. You don't know what the cost of living is like there. You don't know what their day-to-day concerns are. And so the longer you're in Washington, the less connected to reality you are, and the more likely you are to make decisions that don't exactly benefit the people on Main Street in your town, but may benefit the person who you had lunch with 10 times over the past 10 months you get the point.
Yeah.
And I don't think that is because these politicians are bad people or that's what they intended to do when they came to DC. But I do think that the system has become so corrupted that it's almost impossible not to become corrupted yourself in some ways if you want to continue to be reelected and you want to get a good committee assignment and you want to potentially move up in the leadership of the party. So one day you could be the committee chairman, or chairwoman, chairperson. So I think it's very challenging in this environment for what we the people actually want to break through into Washington. And I think that is a big reason why President Trump was such a threat and viewed as such a threat is because, I'm not saying he's a perfect person. And, I don't know about how his companies are doing while he's in office. And I don't know about all of that. I'm not saying he's completely immune, but he is not a product of these systems. And he is not, he is trying, I think, despite as hard as they've fought him with the lawfare and everything else, to at least get rid of some of that corruption and return some of that power back to us as voters.
Yeah, and we were, and kind of like with that, we were talking a little bit earlier about the pandemic and, something that was like crazy then. So my wife works for a hospital system. I won't obviously say their name for obvious reasons, but, my wife, it was like right before, it was kind of like when they had like, oh, we had the first case of COVID in Michigan. Well, they thought she had like a really bad sinus infection. I'm like, it's like the longest sinus infection ever. It was like a couple of weeks and, she was still working in the hospital. I think it was like about, I don't know, maybe a month or so after that is when they kind of started doing lockdowns. And, they were like, hey, we want to do a serology test, to kind of see, they wanted it voluntary, right, for the families. And it turns out me and both of my boys had COVID. So did my wife, but we're guessing that's why my wife was so sick. But the three of us had it. Wouldn't have never even known. So then fast forward, okay, at the time, pretty much, you're going to couldn't keep your job or do certain things if you didn't get the shot. And, at the time I didn't really know a whole lot. And I'm going, okay, well, even at the time, President Trump thought it was a good thing to do. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll get the first two shots. And I mean, that second shot, man, that really knocked me on my keister. But then when I got COVID after the shot, they were like, oh, it's supposed to make it's not so bad. No, when I got COVID after the shot, it was far worse. It was far worse. I could not get out of bed. I had like 103, 104 temperature. It'd be like 104, 2 hours later, 99. And then it would come and go. And then I started taking Paxlovid. And that made everything taste like aluminum foil.
Wow.
And I was like, I'm going, this doesn't seem right. And then they're telling me you need a booster every 6 months. Tell me how it's a vaccine if I got to keep taking it. and I'm not knocking, anybody who needs it, but what really killed me was, and this is where like I really like separated from, oh, hey, it's got to be a vaccine, you have to have it, is my wife is allergic to the flu shot. Like if she gets it, she'll go into anaphylactic shock, end up in a hospital and can die. And that happened in 2014. Before that, she never had an issue. Well, because of how the COVID vaccine made pretty much similar to how the flu shot was made. That's where they used a lot of the basis off of it. So my wife couldn't have it. Well, she had a chance to get a job at a very good firm for, medical, like it would, for organs, things like that. Like it would have been a crazy pay raise and everything. And it was a remote job, 100% remote. She had never had to go to an office. But because she was allergic to the vaccine, they didn't accept, I forget what it's like, exceptions from your employer because of that. Whereas the hospital system did, she couldn't get the job. And I'm like, that's crazy. I guess I could understand if you're working around the patients, you didn't want to mandate it. Okay, fair game. But you're working from home in your house. Like literally, even if you truly believed it, what danger are you posing sitting behind a computer screen?
Yeah. And I think as we look back now, if we're having an open mind and having an open conversation, what happened during COVID, and we talked a lot about this before we started recording, does not resemble science. It is not scientific in any way. And this is a big part of what I saw happen on the left is we sort of get into scientism. And if an expert, sort of like a religion almost, if an expert tells you something, then you can't question it. And you just go along with it. And we've seen, part of what has happened, and I think that has become so divisive, is that especially people on the left have started changing what language means and expecting us just to go along with it. And you mentioned vaccine. The definition of a vaccine used to be that it gives you immunity and stops transmission. But the COVID shot, and I'm going to call it a gene therapy shot because I don't believe it is a vaccine, doesn't do that. Now, that isn't what we were told at the beginning, Joe. If you remember, they told us you're going to get 99% protection. And I've seen a video montage
Yes.
where it just goes down, 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 down. And now it's just supposed to,
These symptoms.
make it less severe, and decrease hospitalization. But even that data has to be suspect. And I'm going to tell you why, because of the way that vaccinated is defined. So if you haven't had whatever the latest recommended shot is, and it hasn't been at least 2 weeks from that latest recommended shot, in most of the data, you're considered unvaccinated. So yes, I know. So for example, if you get the shot and you have an adverse reaction, that adverse reaction is considered in an unvaccinated person if it hasn't been 2 weeks. Even if you were to get myocarditis, which is one of the very well recognized now at this point, especially for young people, potential side effects of the vaccine. I'm sorry, of the shot. Try not to call it a vaccine for the reason I
agree.
Yeah. So you can see how the person who gets to try to control the language can manipulate what all of these things mean. And, that I think people went along with it. Nobody wants to think they might kill grandma. Nobody wants to think they might hurt somebody unknowingly. At the same time, I don't think it's wrong to say, hey, wait a minute, like, I don't think this has been tested enough. Or wait a minute, what is it? If the effect of the shot is only to lessen my severity, shouldn't I get to make that choice? If I can still pass it on, if I can still infect other people, even if I've had this shot, what is the societal rationale? What is the scientific rationale for requiring it of people? Now, maybe they would argue that you have a lower chance of passing it on, but I don't even think they can make that argument based on the data now that it's come out. And, I think so many of the things that happened during COVID, whether it's the mask mandates, which, for kids in school, I mean, you look right on the blue masks and they say they don't stop viruses. I mean, they say it right on there. And all of the studies, when COVID first happened, I did a lot of looking at data and research. And all the studies say that, they can't stop the surgical masks, the blue ones, they can't stop transmission. And, you could go into a long discussion of how big the pores are on them and how small a virus is, and they can pass through. Well, obviously, a cloth mask or putting your shirt up like this, which I saw a lot of people doing,
It doesn't do much.
anything, but, and there's just other ones, if we talked about this before, the 6-foot social distancing, there's absolutely no science or data to back that up. And one of my favorite ones was, okay, you have to wear your mask to get into the restaurant, but once you sit down, you can take it off, you can eat, you can laugh, you can cough, and it's okay. Some of these things might, from sort of a common sense perspective, seem okay, or seem like they might have some truth to them, but we're either believing in the scientific method and data and evidence, or we're not. And if we are, then we shouldn't be mandating things that aren't backed up by science and data. But I think this gets at a really important point about what happened to a lot of people on the left, and that is that they became completely controlled through fear. Fear is one of the oldest control mechanisms. It's extremely effective. When you make someone afraid, what happens is it shuts down their critical thinking ability, and it goes to the reptilian part of your brain, the brainstem, the survival part, which says, I'm going to do whatever it is I have to do to survive. And now you have a government authority that you've put your faith in, and they are telling you this is what you have to do to survive. And anybody who doesn't do it is a threat to you. Okay. And that is what we saw. Sort of like, now everyone on the right, you're a grandma killer. And I think you saw the beginning of where people were like wishing death on unvaccinated people, or saying, well, if you get sick, you shouldn't get treatment because you didn't do your part. You didn't take the vaccine and you're a threat. And all of that is based on not science, right? Now we know this. And in fact, there is some data that I have seen that shows that over time, you actually become more likely to get sick if you're
Yes.
exposed to COVID once you've had the vaccine, the shot. I think it's a really important point. And I think a lot of what has been done to people on the left who are brainwashed and indoctrinated into the cult, as I want to say, I was 100%, is the use of fear in so many different aspects to control people and get them to follow along with whatever narrative is being put before them. I think identity politics is a big example of this, of how you get people to become afraid. And in many cases, that fear turns into anger, which then can turn into violence and aggression against someone you have been conditioned to believe is your enemy. And I think we've seen this in the reaction to the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk on the left. We have seen this, as I said, in the response to COVID. We have seen this, I think, and it's something that I think, need to have a real conversation about. And we have seen this in the gender ideology movement among trans people who have been convinced that there's a trans genocide going on, and that being violent to protect trans people is okay. And we've seen a huge increase over the past few years in the number of I want to say queer identifying, because there's some non-binary in there and all of that, mass shooters. We've seen an escalation of that. And, part of that we should be asking what studies have actually been done about the long-term use of cross-gender hormones. And I did a lot of research on this also for my book, Joe, and I can answer that question with one word: none. None. So, in terms of what does being on estrogen in the long run do to a male psyche? So there really there aren't any studies to point to that really can address that. I mean, it goes so far as to say, like, there haven't even been long-term studies about the long-term emotional and psychological impact of being on birth control for women. That
Ah,
might
that
be
part I did
really
not know.
shocking, but it's true. But you might want to ask yourself, why are so many 40 and 50-year-old women on antidepressants? And why are so many 40 and 50 and 60-year-old women on anti-anxiety drugs? What has happened to their emotional state? So I guess this all just comes back to, we sort of have this religious faith in science. And I think, sadly, that it's very misplaced. And there's just sort of an assumption that, of course, they studied all these things. The FDA would never approve this without checking. And I think
Yeah, I thought the same thing.
as did I, as did I. And I, but I think, women are on birth control often for 30, 40 years. And we definitely have seen a huge increase in the number of women with, you know, psychological concerns. I don't want to say it's not mental illness. I think, there are a lot of things, a lot of reasons why it might kind of make sense to be depressed in today's world, especially if you don't have a good connection to your faith, if you have it, whatever that means to you, a good connection to your community and your family and friends. But I also think that we've been messing around with people's chemistry a lot without really digging into what does that do to their mental and spiritual health.
Yeah, that kind of goes, and actually in relation to your book, your book, sorry, deprogramming Democrats and uneducating the elites. And like I was talking to you earlier, some of the research that I had done, and it was a Yale poll about how Gen Z, the voting age Gen Z, the ones that are able to vote 18 to 21, are 12 points more conservative. They're actually a majority of them so far have become conservative. And it was complete shock to me. I mean, you would have never convinced me until I seen it with my own eyes. Like, I'd have been like, you're nuts, you're crazy. I see these kids all day. But then and what really got me looking into it was what happened with Charlie Kirk. And then I'm seeing all of these young kids saying, I don't know, I don't agree with the guy, but he was a good person. Or, he was this or he was that. And I was like, what, how come the media is not covering this? How come the media is not going, hey, even conservative media doesn't cover Gen Z turning conservative, because even in their minds, they're crazy woke lefties. That's how they think about it. And they're completely missing the boat that there's an upcoming generation that shares. I mean, you can call it conservative, right? But I think when you actually dig deep down into it, a lot of them just want like openness. They want transparency. They want to know they want to know what's going on in their lives. And like in my work, I always tell people, when you train someone, you got to do more than say, just do it. You got to give them the who, what, when, where, why, and why we want this outcome. And this is how you can impact it, and give them a framework and let them work within that framework. And you will get the best outcome out of that person. Most people, some people don't work good in that, but and it's wild to me. Your book is like almost like what's happening to Gen Z. They're being deprogrammed somehow.
Well, I do have a question for you about that, Joe. And I thought about this before
Sure.
when we mentioned that. Was that broken down by gender that you saw, or by sex?
Yes, mainly male.
And that's
It was
what I
like it
was
was
going to say.
60% male.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think, sadly, we have a lot of work to do with young women. Think that a lot, and there are men like this too, I'm sure, in Gen Z, but I think that there is a lot of more of the buying into the narratives that we've been talking about among the young women. And I think that, you know, I've watched a lot of Charlie Kirk's campus events since he was tragically assassinated. I had seen him speak in person on a number of occasions. Did not know him, just so to be clear about that to your listeners. But his approach, I think, would generally be more effective among young males. And part of that is that I think there is a level of I don't know what let me be careful about how I phrase this, but I think that have to come at it maybe a little bit softer for the women. Um, and
Yes.
this in Deprogramming Democrats, there is a chapter about how do you wake yourself up, but also how do you try to help someone that you might care about. And it's very similar in that it starts with asking questions. It's the Socratic method. However, I don't know that you will ever get through to women using the statistics in the way that Charlie really was very successful at getting through to the young men. And I encourage people, if you're trying to talk to a young woman and help her wake up, to have your question not be something that presupposes an answer or uses statistics that they might question given the source or given you being the source. And I think that, you know, these questions can help like sort of validate this young woman as that you care about them, that you care what they have to say, what they think. And it, obviously I will say Charlie was fantastic at helping get through to young people. And I'm not in any way meaning to put him down or downgrade him. And I just want to make that clear. I think yes, and this can also be another way to get through to some people that you might not be able to reach otherwise, is to say, I'm really interested to understand, which he would do, where you're coming from, but he would push back. I mean, you've seen his discussions. You said you had looked at some
Oh
of
yeah.
them. Yeah. And he would
Oh
push
yeah.
back with statistics and push back pretty hard. And I would never say lie to someone, but you can ask these questions where you're never really telling them anything, but you're getting what you're doing is forcing them to go down a path, and maybe where they get to a question they can't answer, like I couldn't answer about if they'll poison our water. And so I think that with some of these Gen Z women, and I would say Gen X all the way down to Gen Z women, that can be a really effective technique as well. And not instead of, but as well. Because often when you start having quoting statistics that they don't agree with, it shuts down the process for these young women. And I'm sure that Charlie was very successful with young women too, but I do think there are some young women who can be reached with a questioning approach, fully questioning, that may not be able to be reached with a questioning plus facts.
Right. No, that's so thinking of that in relation to Charlie Kirk and those, what are like some of like the strongest reactions you've had to that book? Because I can imagine there's some folks out there that are probably like, holy cannoli.
Yeah, I mean, the reactions have been really sort of mostly very positive. I know that the title is extremely sort of can be, what word, incendiary. It makes, because the last part of the title, and by the way, just so everybody knows, you can get the book on Amazon and you can get it at Barnes and Noble, and I do have a website. But the full title is Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating Elite: How I Escaped the Progressive Cult. And so calling it a cult does get a strong reaction from some people. But I think, once you start having a conversation with me, just like I think you can tell I'm not unreasonable. I don't hate people on either side. My whole thing is about everybody having control of their own mind and being able to ask questions and come to their own conclusions without being made to feel like they're an immoral bad person. And I think that's what has happened on the left as the JFK liberalism evolved into the progressive cult that we see today, is that if you don't toe the party line, it's not just that you disagree, it's that you're immoral, that you're a bad person, that you obviously don't care about other people who aren't like you. And I think once you start talking to me, you can see that that's not true with me. And I think that's part of it. But I there have been some, I get a lot of just called names. That's often what will happen. And I encourage people to also think that when you get to that point where you've asked these questions, and which is what I always do if I'm talking to someone who might disagree with me, I just ask them questions, and they start calling you a name, consider that a win in some ways. I don't think you're ever gonna, I've never had a conversation, I'll tell you, where I've been asking these questions and someone goes, oh my God, you changed my mind in the moment. But you've planted a seed in their mind. And really what I have always tried to do is just get people to think for themselves. Just start asking questions yourself. And so, yeah, I've been called a lot of things. I've been, people tell me my book is gaslighting, it's propaganda. It's all the things that I'm accusing, or I shouldn't say accusing. It's all the things that I provide evidence and research about that I believe has happened from the establishment to both sides, but mostly, again, my experience is on the left. And, I think that, again, I want to reject the left-right dichotomy and put it into an establishment versus non-establishment perspective, in that if you push too hard against the establishment, whether you're on the left or the right, it's going to come after you. It's going to protect itself. And so the media, I used to joke around, when people would say, oh, the media has a left-wing bias, I would joke around and say, no, facts have a left-wing bias. Okay. And now I don't think that's true at all. I definitely do think that when you have way more, a higher percentage of journalists, and I'm blanking, I do have all the numbers in the book, but when 8 out of 10 journalists view themselves as Democrats, you're going to have a left-wing bias, and news is no longer just, here are the facts. You just go to CNN and it'll tell you, here's the top 5 takeaways from last night's speech and what you should think about them. And that's considered a news story. It used to be that would be an editorial or opinion story, but now that's news. But why don't you just tell me what all of the takeaways were, and then I can make a decision myself. So sometimes it's literally, what story do they cover and what story don't they cover? Sometimes it's, what story are they covering and how do they cover it? And then some, it's just, did they cover it and then quickly move on because they don't want you paying attention to it? Like, for example, the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, or the Maui fires. Whatever happened to all the people there? What happened to the kids? Why was the road closed? All those things. Within a day, we were moving up. The news cycle told us we should move on to something else. And in our high technology environment, which you and I talked about this a little bit too, that's really powerful. If every news story has moved on, your memory of it is only going to be as good as you make your memory of it. And a lot of people forget and they move on to the next story. And so the whole point being that, left or right, if this story is inconvenient to the current establishment, the media is probably going to move on from that. And I'm sure you have probably heard of Operation Mockingbird.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm
Yes,
sure
I have.
most of your listeners probably have. I talk about it quite a bit in the book, but I think it's an important thing to bring up in this context, in that it's not clear to me that we've ever really had an independent media. I do think that it has gotten much worse in recent years. You can immediately see that the media is using words. They're all using the same word. For example, how quickly did January 6th become an insurrection in every platform? And then, without even thinking, hey, most of these people on the right are all armed to the teeth and none of them brought guns. Worst insurrection ever. I'm making a joke. I'm sorry. I don't mean to joke, but
No, you're totally fine.
But you know what I mean? It's like, okay, so it's an insurrection.
Yeah.
Well, where did that word come from? There's a video montage of all these different news stations. Hopefully I'm using the right phrase, but they're all saying it is a danger to our democracy. And it is every Sinclair news station in the country echoing that same talking point. Well, where did it come from? Well, it comes from the top down, and there's only 6 companies that own all of the mainstream media in this country now, 6 companies. And when I say mainstream media, that isn't, it's news, it's television programming, it's video games, it's music, it's everything that you take into your mind that comes from these big corporations, and they are coordinating on what those messages are in many instances. And so it becomes really easy to try to control what the narrative is.
And and talking like the narrative, right? What advice? Because obviously you've seen the behind the scenes. We talked about some of those key things. We talked about some what's in your book. Like, so what advice would you give people that are kind of stuck in the middle, where they, kind of like you, where they still have some values that are on that side, right? But they've definitely, they've switched sides, or they've gone towards the middle. Like, you've navigated that. Like, how, maybe some people are afraid to navigate that because they're with their friends that view, like, how do they navigate that without alienating their life possibly?
Um, it's very challenging, Joe. I would say that from 2023 to about the end of, or 2020 to the end of 2023 were some of the hardest days of my life. I lost almost all of my friends. Some of my family, I haven't lost them, but I hesitate to reach out because we are just at such different places. Now, having said that, I have made so many new friends, and I'm hoping that we're going to have a friendship after this. I've been so
Yes.
well received by just being honest and open and who I am. And there's a few things that I would suggest. One is get off of your technology and talk to real people. Meet them in person. Try to, go to a group that might think more like you're thinking, and be true to yourself. And I have received nothing but welcoming from anyone who's not still fully immersed in what I would call the progressive cult. One of the things that I think has happened to a lot of people on the left is that survival instinct I was talking about has replaced their principles. It's replaced the ends now justify the means. So as long as I'm going to be free in my mind, or I'm going to be safe, it doesn't matter who I hurt. It doesn't matter who gets hurt in the process. And I would encourage people to really reclaim the principles that matter to them. And for me, one of those principles was free speech. One of those that I can't compromise on. I would have
Right.
more respect right now for someone who says something I think is absolutely morally repugnant, but believes I have a right to say that I believe it's morally repugnant, than someone who would want to censor my speech or mandate my speech through something like forced use of pronouns or something like that. So get back to what your principles are and find people who share those principles. And you will find them, and it is really important. I mean, another really important principle to me is equality, which is very different than equity. And I would put it this way: equality of opportunity, which I think we really have. We had really come a long way, and we're pretty close to having that, equality of opportunity. We can't ever have equality of outcomes and have individual freedom. So if equality is important to you, then remember that and base your connections on that. So get back to your principles, disconnect from technology, and experience people in the real world. It's really easy to hate someone through a computer screen. It's a lot harder to look them in the eyes and to feel their heartbeat in your own, proximity, and hate that person. And, part of what we have to do, I think, to unify is to stop dehumanizing one another, stop making assumptions about who someone is without even talking to them about it, and I would also say explore your faith. I think that when we are disconnected from one another and disconnected from our creator and or the energy we come from, it becomes a lot easier to hate. It becomes a lot easier to be afraid and be despondent and to create the kind of atmosphere we have. So if you can reconnect with the creator in whatever way is meaningful to you, if you can reconnect with your fellow humans in person, and reconnect with nature. Some amazing things out there, and we like, again, technology is an amazing thing. You and I are half a country away having this conversation. I have information at my fingertips that can help me to prove or disprove with evidence a point. But I just don't think that can replace real human in-person connection. And the more disconnected we become, the harder it is for us to recognize that we all have more in common than divides us. And if we just look for that, we can agree to disagree about certain things without it being a moral failing on either person's part. I think that's what I would say. It is very hard to do, but so worth it. Like I said, I have made real friends that I can be my authentic self with and not have to worry if I say something that they don't 100% agree with, they're going to dox me and, cancel me and all of those things. And which is a big part of the way that the cult controls people who are members of it, is that fear of that. And I am not saying that fear is unfounded. What I am saying is that the light on the other side, after reclaiming your mind and being free to be who you are, is worth it, even if it is really, really.
Yeah, it is. When you're thinking of that, right? If you had the ear of like party leaders, what's like one thing you would say for that? Because, it's like, no matter what, right? There's always still going to be people on the left, people on the right, and somebody, like, how can we get these folks to understand that? Because it seems like, at least to the public, right, when you turn on TV, any website, that if these two seen each other down a dark alley, Lord knows what might happen. So like, what can we do to get out of that?
You mean with the party leaders? Yeah,
Yeah, party leaders.
I hate to say this in some ways, I think we need new leaders. Um, and I think we need, like, in some ways, I think we need new parties too. I don't want to go to like a European, there's 1,700 parties and it's a unity government and all of the things that we see in a lot of other countries. But I think that these parties the party apparatus is so powerful. And I'm going to blank right now which of our founding fathers really warned about this, like parties can be a huge
Yeah.
problem. I
Believe it was George Washington, if I'm correct.
It might be. I can't remember for sure, Joe. So we'll go with that. But I think the parties have really gotten too powerful, and in some ways, again, it's not Democrat versus Republican; it's establishment. And basically, once you give someone power, it's really hard to get them to give it up. And that's part of why I mentioned term limits before. I don't think that the term limit should be really short. Maybe like 20 years. That could be a good, so like maybe 3 Senate terms and 9 House terms, that's 18 years each. Because that would give enough that the experience can get through and you can, like it does take time to learn Washington and learn how to navigate so you can be effective for your constituents once you get there. And maybe it's 12 years. I don't know. But I don't think it should just be 2 years or 4 years because you're just really learning how everything works at that point. But that's how, and that would mean you would be getting new leaders every decade or so into the party. And that there isn't some way you can hold on to that power and grow it. But, when we look at who's in power now, it's no wonder that they're representing a generation of people. Like, I think one of the things that is really clear is how out of touch most of people in Washington are for the real economic concerns of most people who live in this country. And when you've been in Congress for 40 years, you don't know what it's like to have a monthly budget where like I'm making a choice
Right.
between my food and my pharmaceutical drugs. You don't know what that's like anymore. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't pay the people well who, are our representatives. But I also think that getting new leaders and potentially, I hate to say it because I know, like we've had libertarians, we've had a few other parties try to break through, the Green Party, and they can't. But I do think we're in a different time. I do think that we've reached a point where people who never used to think about politics now. Because of what happened with COVID, especially, it had such a huge direct impact on our life, and we're never going to get the 2 years back for the kids who have developmental delays because of the masks. We can't get those back, but what we can do is hold our politicians to account and not let it ever happen again, because we're paying attention now. And so, if we did have some term limits, and maybe the other thing I think is that people, when we see things like crowdsourcing now, I think a lot more people might give $5 to a new party that wouldn't have done it before, because it's sort of more in our consciousness that when regular people can put their money together, they can create a voice for themselves in a way that we never used to be able to. And so maybe technology can foster a third party that can actually work and take on this party apparatus. I think overall, we just have to come up with ways that we can make our elected representatives more accountable to the people who vote for them and less accountable to the people who give them money. And one way to do that is to limit how long they can be there.
Yeah, I mean, and these days it's sad we have to have a law because, in the founding fathers' times, I believe George Washington had to, they did the 2-term limit, especially for presidents, voluntarily. They didn't need a law because, they were like, hey, it's not a good idea. And I wish our politicians today, would do that. As we wrap up, from your perspective, I have mine, like, after I've learned a little bit more about Gen Z, that definitely gives me some hope. From your perspective, in your book, right? What gives you some hope that America can move forward?
Well, there are a lot of people waking up, and I think if you'd have said to me, I'll use the gender ideology piece as an example. If you'd have said to me like 10 years ago that we would sort of be now asking questions about whether transitioning is actually good for youth, and we could have a public conversation about that, I wouldn't have thought that was true, because everyone was so careful and canceled and all the, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
But that's not where we are. We're moving towards, to me, if a young person so doesn't like themselves that they feel like they need to chemically and surgically alter their body, what is going on with them? Let's have a conversation about mental health for them, about what we might be able to do to address that. If I would have said that, I might have been canceled a number of years ago, but we've moved in that direction. And more parents are standing up to school boards and saying, no males
Yes.
in female sports, and all of those kind of things. So I see people being willing to speak up and take a stand. I see lots of people waking up. And I think, the reaction to the Charlie Kirk assassination on the left woke a lot of people on the left up. And they said, I am no longer ever voting Democrat again, because I don't care who you are. I don't care how much I disagree with you. I'm not going to wish death on you. I am not going to celebrate that we now have 2 fatherless children and a widow. And so these are things that give me hope. And I think my own story should give people a lot of hope, because if I could wake up,
Most definitely.
anybody can. And it's really about not writing off the person because they have been brainwashed. It is about the fact that people can recover their minds from the brainwashing and programming. And at a basic level, as long as we continue to respect each other as human beings and look for that commonality, I think we can have a bright future. And I think that the more we can unite around principles like freedom of speech, like returning to the beginning of what our foundations of our country were, restoring the power of the states and the local communities to really determine the direction for the people who are most closely associated with it, and taking that power back away from Washington, D.C., the brighter the future gets. So that's the hope I would end on, and just keep having conversations, keep speaking truth. And I encourage everyone to be brave. It's fear is how they control you, and bravery is how you set yourself free.
Yeah, and I definitely would love to have you back on because you've got some great perspectives, and especially with everything going on these days, you can provide a lot of insight into the world that a lot of people may not have, and that you just some of the stuff you see, you just can't trust. When you look at it, you're just like, should I trust this? Should I not? Is this real? Is this not real? And sometimes, not even necessarily like, it's just more of like that perspective that gives them the direction to go in. Like, okay, hey, because like, we were talking about earlier, and it was crazy that you said perception is reality because I say that all the time. Like me, my mindset is stuck back in the 1990s. Like, man, things were a little bit more peaceful then. Not necessarily that it was peaceful, right? But I think it's the fact that technology wasn't so involved in every little thing we did. We're able to live in the moment, and that made it more real to us. And that's what, like, I told my son, I said, you don't have as close friends as I had back then because my best friend, I've been best friends with him since I'm in fifth grade. And because, if you wanted to play a game with your buddy, you had to go to his house or he had to come to your house. And those little nuances that people do that none of us even realize we all do, like that little head turn or whatever it is, that doesn't come across in technology the way it does in person when you're having a conversation. The body language, all that stuff that, hey, would you like a cup of coffee today? That changes how we all interact. And I think that's where, things I did as a wrap up, I just recorded an episode the other day with a former NBC reporter. He's hacking your mind. He did a thing on PBS with that. He's done a lot. And he said, most of the big tech titans that have all these products, they don't let their kids use them until they get to a certain age. Whereas us, the general public, we put it in our kids' hands 2, 3, 4 years old. And if you look at, we always think, well, they're rich, that's why their kids don't have these problems. No, the big thing that they do is they say, you're 8 years old, you don't need Facebook. You're 8 years old, you don't need this. And then they find other things. And I thought that was, and he's worked with a lot of the big tech companies, and he's done a lot of that. And it was really telling, and I was very surprised by that. I mean, like, obviously I figured, to a degree, but I guess I just didn't realize it was to the scale that it was, where they would limit their kids from all these products that they tell you to put in your kids' hands.
Yeah, I think, it's really interesting. And Joe, I'd be happy to come back anytime. I really enjoyed the conversation. So just, reach out and let me know. But one of the things that I think might be a really interesting conversation to have is when you think about a Gen Zer or a younger millennial, what is the reality that they grew up in? And what is the perception of America in the reality they grew up in? Because it is very, very different than mine and probably yours. People who
Big
grew
time.
up in the 80s and 90s, the reality of America was a very different thing. And I think we could do a whole show just kind of talking about that. I think technology is an amazing thing, and it's also one of the most destructive things, from the human experience that has happened. And yeah, I remember, my partner has a, a grandson who will be 4 in a couple of months. And at his first birthday party, people had bought him tablets. And we had bought him books. We bought books. And I was like, I just can't wrap I grew up with no technology. I talk to young people sometimes and they laugh because I was like, yeah, we didn't have call waiting. Okay. Like you got a busy signal and you had to call back. We didn't even have an answering machine. There was no microwave. So there's been huge changes, and that has a big impact on the perception of the world. And so I think you're right. But it's great that
And
people, yeah, go ahead.
oh yeah, no, before we like close, I work with a lot of people, and one of the big things I always say to like my bosses is I say, I I don't hate technology. I like it, right? But we do a lot of training on a tablet now. And when I was coming up through the process, before I got a promotion, the thing was, God, it had 18 modules. And you had to actually open it up. You had to go out into the areas. You had to like, okay, how does this work? How does this do this? And what it did is it made you engage it to remember it. Whereas technology, and you don't engage it the same way. And it's not calling kids now stupid. What I think it is it disconnects them from that. And then when they have to deal with certain situations, they're not equipped because they didn't have to go out there and they didn't have to touch it. They didn't have to feel it. Human beings, we have nerves. So we work on touch, feel, smell, vision, and that stuff is not there. And I told them, I said, I learned a lot because I had to open up a manual and that manual would be like, hey, go to this piece of equipment, pull this part off, get me this number. What does this number do? You put it in there and then the next page tells you what the number does. And it made you think differently. And when I see a lot of kids today, you say, hey, can you sweep them up? They look and go, why? And you're just like sitting there and you're going, why are you even asking that question? Like, and they just kind of go, and then you're just looking at you not with anger, you're just looking at pure confusion on both sides. And I think that's because they don't have to get their hands on.
Yeah, just to add to that really quickly, the other thing I think that happens is if you ask a kid a question, they reach for the phone, their minds don't create content anymore. They just look to get fed content. And so I think that works in tandem with what you were talking about. It's like, well, if they had been online and they would have explained, well, you have to sweep the floor because it's dirty or whatever, but their brain isn't going to just think it through without it having been fed to them. And I think that's a big challenge. Oftentimes my partner and I Jamie, he will be like, hey, what year did so-and-so happen? And he's like, don't pick that phone up. Try to think of it before you do. Just to try to make sure we're continuing to exercise the pathways in the brain that would recall something like that. So
yeah, because if you don't use them, they go dormant.
they do.
And then, because I don't think they don't tell people a lot that using those pathways is what really, I forget how that creates more neurons or whatever it was so your brain keeps firing more and more and more and you get more cognitive reasoning.
So when you sit there and you just watch TikTok video after TikTok video, not a lot going on in the neurons in the brain. So
yeah, no.
So that was part of why I said put the technology down and go outside and reconnect with nature and take a walk with a friend and all of that. And I think the future can be very bright. We make choices every day.
I think it is.
Yeah.
And I think Gen Z is going to be a little bit just the more I learn about it. I don't know what they'll end up being, but I think they're not getting enough credit for their openness as I'm learning, right? Definitely a little bit more among males than women. Pastor Jackson had talked about in his thing that back in the day, it used to be mom that dragged dad to church. Well, now it's the man that wants to go to church more than the woman. So he's like, that's a big shift in our society. And he said, but to a degree, it's kind of, I want to say mending fences to a degree. I think that's where he was trying to get at with it. But, Lisa, I really appreciate you coming on. Thanks for tuning in, everybody here. Lisa's, gosh, by far the biggest wealth of information I've had in a long time. And her mindset will help bring more voices to the middle area, right? Because it's going to get people to pull in and, science is like we were talking in the beginning, science is about essentially questioning everything to me. It's the whole purpose of it is to go, this is this, like either like the Tylenol debate. Okay, yeah, depending on how you want to look at it, it can be viewed different ways, right? But the idea is to question it. Is it the pure cause? No, but can it contribute to it in certain situations? Possibly. And I think that that's a fair thing to look at, and people got to stop being so closed-minded. Look at our European counterparts. They have far less problems than we do medically and with chronic diseases. And I don't think it's a bad thing to kind of look at them and go, well, what do you do differently than we do? It's our founding fathers, the way we do armies now, they went to Europe to figure it out. Even though they knew, but they went to Europe to figure out how to, put everything together. So, I just think that, the media kind of gets everybody turned off of that. So, but, thanks everybody for tuning in. Lisa is a fountain of information. Obviously, definitely check out her book, Deprogramming Democrats. And, Reprogramming the Elites, I think, is that how you say it?
Uneducating the
Or
elites.
Uneducating the Elites. My apologies. My apologies.
Yeah, I
You
steer clear of reprogramming anybody, Joe, because I just want open minds. Program yourself.
yeah, no, for sure. And it's a great thing to check out. I did read a little bit of it, like on the preview on Amazon, so I did order a copy. I checked on Amazon, they give it a little preview. I love that, and it's going to be something that I've got so many books on my shelves, but it's definitely going to be one of my favorite ones. I can tell you that for sure. And thank you for what you do. Everybody's got to be willing to open their minds and be willing to see beyond what they already know.
Knowledge is power.
And you have a good day, Lisa.
You too, Joe. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.